The quitting bell was minutes away. On the 9th floor of the Asch Building, just east of Washington Square in New York City, nearly 300 women and girls sat at long lines of sewing machines, finishing the last blouses of the week. It was a Saturday afternoon, the 25th of March, 1911, and the pay envelopes were already in their pockets. Coats waited on hooks by the cloakroom. Sisters waited for sisters. In a few more minutes, they would pour down the stairs into the spring evening, with a whole Sunday of their own ahead of them. 1 floor below, in a wooden bin under a cutter's table, 2 months of cotton scraps sat piled to the brim. What happened next took roughly 18 minutes. When it was over, 146 people were dead, most of them immigrant girls and young women, some of them 14 years old. And the question of why they could not get out, the question of one locked door, would take another 20 years to finish answering. The fire is the famous part. The door is the story. The Triangle Waist Company was the largest maker of shirtwaists in New York. The shirtwaist was the tailored blouse of the modern working woman, the uniform of every office and shop floor in the city, and the 2 men who owned the company had ridden it from steerage to Fifth Avenue. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were immigrants themselves, and the papers called them the Shirtwaist Kings. Their factory filled the top 3 floors of a modern loft building, bright, tall windows, and more cotton in one room than a person could imagine burning. The women who worked the machines were the newest New Yorkers, Jewish girls from Russia, Italian girls a few years off the boat, many of them teenagers carrying a family's rent in those pay envelopes. And every evening they left the same way, single file, through one door on the Green Street side, where a watchman looked through their bags to make sure no one carried out a blouse or a scrap of lace. The second door, on the Washington Place side, was kept locked during working hours. That was company policy. Isaac Harris would later admit under oath that everything ever stolen from the Triangle Waist Company added up to less than $25. At about 20 minutes to 5, in the scrap bin on the 8th floor, something caught. The fire marshal thought a match or a cigarette end, dropped where smoking was forbidden, and, the workers said, common anyway. Cotton burns fast. Flame climbed out of the bin into the paper patterns hanging above the tables, and the room began to go. The 8th floor still had its warning. Workers there reached the stairs and the elevators while the fire was young, and a bookkeeper cranked the telephone and shouted the alarm up to the 10th floor, where the owners were. No one reached the 9th. On the 10th floor, Blank and Harris gathered the office staff. Blank had his 2 young daughters with him that afternoon, and climbed to the roof, where students from the university building next door laid ladders across the gap and pulled them over, singed but alive. The 8th floor mostly got out. The 9th floor got the fire itself, rising through the windows and the stairwell all at once, with no telephone call and no more time. They ran where anyone runs, to the doors. The Green Street stairway was already filling with flame. The crowd turned and pressed against the Washington Place door, the locked one, and it did not give. At the front of that crowd, a young woman named Margaret Schwartz died with her hands on it. The elevator men kept coming anyway. Joseph Zito and his partner ran their cars up into the smoke again and again. Girls packed 40 at a time into a car built for a fraction of that, others jumping down onto its roof as it dropped, until the heat bent the rails in the shaft, and the cars could not rise anymore. Those runs saved something like 150 lives, half of everyone who got out. The building's one fire escape, a narrow iron ladder down the back, filled with people, sagged in the heat and ripped away from the wall. At least 20 fell with it. Down on the street, the fire department's tallest ladders cranked up and stopped, At the 6th floor, 2 floors below the fire, firemen and bystanders stretched life nets, and the nets ripped. The women on the 9th floor windowsills could feel the fire at their backs and see the crowd below them, and they began to step out into the air, some alone, some holding hands. A wire reporter named William Gunn Shepard stood in that crowd and counted, and phoned his story in while it happened. "I learned a new sound," he wrote, "a more horrible sound than description can picture, the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk." He counted 62. In the same crowd stood a 31-year-old social worker named Frances Perkins, who had been having tea near the square when the engines went past. She would be a very different person by the time she went home. Remember her. 18 minutes, roughly, from the scrap bin to the last of it. The building barely burned. It was fireproof, and it stands today. Everything inside the fireproof building was what burned. That night, the city carried the dead to a covered pier on the East River, and the papers learned to call it Misery Lane. For days, families filed down the lines of numbered boxes, looking for a face, a ring, a mended shoe they knew. The first front pages counted 141 dead. The number kept growing as the pier gave up its answers, and it stopped at 146. The youngest were 14, Kate Leone and Rosaria Maltese, buried on the same Tuesday, 3 days after the fire. The city's grief lasted a week before it turned into something harder. On the 2nd of April, at a memorial meeting in the Metropolitan Opera House, a garment worker and union organizer named Rose Schneiderman stood up in front of the wealthy of New York and refused to comfort them. "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies," she said, "if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting." 3 days later, the Garment Workers Union buried its dead. The procession marched up Fifth Avenue in driving rain, well over 100,000 walking behind empty hearses, hundreds of thousands more standing silent in the downpour to watch them pass. The trial came in December 1911. Blank and Harris charged with manslaughter for the locked Washington Place door. 3 weeks, more than 150 witnesses. Survivor after survivor swore the door had been locked. A young woman named Kate Alterman told the jury what she had seen there. A whole crowd around the door, the manager's brother trying to force it, and Margaret Schwartz burning beside her. The defense lawyer, Max Steuer, made her tell it again, then a second time, then a third, word for word. And then he told the jury that a story repeated in the same words must be a rehearsed one. Her account never changed, and that was the argument against her. The judge instructed the jury that it was not enough for the door to have been locked. The owners had to have known it was locked. That day, that hour. The jury took less than 2 hours. Not guilty on every count. 3 years after the fire, the civil suits ended in a settlement, $75 for each of the dead. The insurance companies, meanwhile, had already paid Blank and Harris well above their documented losses. Roughly $400 it worked out for every worker who died. The arithmetic of the Asch Building was now plain for anyone to read. A life at the Triangle Waste Company was worth $75 to its family and about $400 to its owners. But the fire had lit something the verdict could not put out. Within 3 months of that Saturday, New York created a factory investigating commission run by 2 ambitious Albany politicians, Robert Wagner and Al Smith. And its chief investigator was the young woman from the crowd at Washington Square. Frances Perkins walked lawmakers up tenement stairs and onto factory floors and made them look. In 3 years, New York passed more than 30 new labor laws, Fire drills, sprinklers, exit doors that had to open outward and had to stay unlocked. It became the model for the country, and Perkins kept going. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt made her Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever to sit in an American cabinet, and the laws she carried with her, Social Security, the minimum wage, the 40-hour week, grew straight out of the casework that began on that sidewalk. She said, all her life, that everything she became started with what she watched that afternoon. The dead took longer to get their due. 6 of the 146 lay unnamed for a century, until a researcher matched the last of them to their families in February of 2011. Among them, Fanny Rosen, 21 years old, who had worked at the Triangle Waste Company for exactly 2 days. 115 years after the Asch Building, on the 9th of July, 2026, fire broke out in a ground floor storage area of a shoe factory in Jinjiang, China. A room stacked with flammable material in a building full of workers. 28 of them died. The exits and stairwells, the city's own fire chief said, were blocked with shoe materials, and the dead were found on the roof, where they had climbed looking for a way down that did not exist. The owner was detained within a day. The story is still being investigated, and the country is different, and the century is different. The fire is not. It is always the same fire and the same question waiting in the ashes. Who decided about the doors, and what happened to them afterward? Here is what happened to Max Blank. In the summer of 1913, 2 years after 146 people died behind his locked door, he was arrested again for locking the door of his factory during working hours with the workers inside. He was fined $20. The judge, the papers reported, apologized to him for the inconvenience. In Jinjiang, the investigation is still open, but the post-mortem writes itself. The only question is whether anyone reads it before the next one.